Melody is the basis of music. This should be obvious to pretty much everybody. Melody is what we remember when we think of music from our past. Melody is what floats to the top of a four-part choral texture. Melody is what evolved first historically, before counterpoint, before harmony, before orchestration. Melody is the basis of music. This should be obvious, but it's not. Most music theory teachers give scant attention to melody. Most music theory books hardly mention it at all. With titles like Practical Manual of Harmony, a Theory of Harmony, 20th Century Harmony, Theory of Harmony. This one's really called Harmony Lehre. And finally, Harmony. It's evident that their emphasis lies elsewhere. Adolph Bernard Marx, commonly referred to as A.B. Marx, gave melody its due. His massive study of music, Die Lehre von der musikalischen Komposition, covered every topic of interest to musicians, from fundamental music theory to harmony to counterpoint to orchestration. The most extraordinary thing about his book was how he dealt with melody. He began with the simplest, most fundamental melodies and used them as building blocks to create more and more elaborate musical structures, finally creating complete compositions. I'd like to run you through this process. I'm going to do it a little bit differently than Marx would have done. Please bear with me. Let's start with a simple fundamental musical structure, a descending scale. Well, there's really not very much to that, but it could become the basis of a melody. Many melodies are based on descending scales. Joy to the World begins with a descending scale. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is about half made up of about half a descending scale. Three Blind Mice made up of snippets of a descending scale. As it stands, our scale is missing a number of things that are typical of well-formed melodic phrases. For example, it's missing a meter. So let's supply it with one. Let's say 2-4. When we put the scale in 2-4, the last note ends up right before the bar line on a weak beat. The scale would be much more convincing as a melodic phrase if it ended on a downbeat. So let's scoot it over so that the last note of the scale ends on a downbeat. This is better, but still not ideal. By having our phrase end on tonic, we've given it perhaps too strong a sense of closure. It would be nice if it felt like this phrase was not an ending, that in fact the music was going to continue on. In order to create that effect, let's have the phrase end on something other than tonic. I suggest we add a few extra notes to the end of the scale and end on dominant. By doing that, we end up back where we were a second ago with the last note of the scale, not on a downbeat. So let's move the whole scale back so that the last note ends on a downbeat. This leaves us with a two-note pickup, the rest of the scale, and then the final note, the dominant, on a downbeat. This is our first melodic building block. Let's create a second melodic building block. The easiest way to do this is to take the first phrase, repeat it, and add a different ending. This is known as a consequent phrase. By putting these two phrases together, we've created something called a period. How do we know that we have two phrases? How do we know that we have a phrase at all? Well, we know where phrases start and stop because we can detect their ending by looking for their cadences. Cadences are places where the rhythmic motion stops. This can be either because of a long rhythmic value or because rests are inserted. In this case, we have two notes that are longer than the others, one at the end of the second measure, one at the end of the fourth measure. Therefore, two phrases because we have two cadences. I can't say I actually like our second phrase very much. It's a lot like our first phrase, which is nothing but a descending scale. So let's change up our second phrase a little bit. Let's make it an ascending scale instead of a descending one. There are two things that still bother me about this second phrase. One is that the cadence is just too long in that second measure. It's desirable to have a nice stopping place, but it feels to me like it needs to start moving before it actually does. So my suggestion is, let's pick up an idea from the very beginning and add 2 16th note pickups going into the second phrase. I also don't like the ending of the second phrase. It's good that it ends on a B. This is a note that is not tonic, so it seems like it promises that there will be more music to come. But still, it seems to me like it happens a little bit too early. It seems to me like ending on the downbeat is just a little bit too predictable. So let's scoot it over a beat and put a C on the downbeat before it. Creating 2 more phrases ought to be easy. The third phrase can simply be a copy of the first one. So let's copy that out and plop it down after the second phrase. The last phrase probably should be a descending scale ending on tonic. But to be just a little bit clever about it, let's have it end on supertonic instead. Then move to a dominant and then have the dominant finally go to tonic for a final cadence. This is a kind of a just kidding cadence. The audience will think that this particular phrase is going to be open-ended like the others, that it's going to end on supertonic and that there'll be another phrase before the end of the section, but just kidding, it goes to dominant and then ends on tonic. At this point, we have a complete musical structure. I could call it a double period. The reason I'm calling it a double period is it's made up of 2 periods, each with 2 phrases. I'm going to label it with a capital letter A. One of the things that's confusing about this whole idea of melodic building blocks is that we can have building blocks at different levels in a hierarchy. The capital letter A that we just created is one level up in the hierarchy from the smaller letters that we created earlier. And it contains 4 of the smaller blocks in one of the larger blocks. So we can have large blocks at a higher level in the hierarchy contain smaller blocks at a lower level in the hierarchy. The other thing that's confusing is that the same letters keep reappearing and they mean different things. For example, we have a large letter A. That means the entire first section. We have a small letter A. That's referring to the first phrase. We're going to create another section, and we're going to call this a capital letter B. And guess what? It's going to have 3 phrases in it, and each one of those is going to be labeled a small letter A, B, and C. Ultimately, the letters that we choose don't really matter. They're just an arbitrary abstraction of what the music really is. The next section of the piece should be different from the first, but maybe not too different. Let's still base it on a descending scale, but maybe start it on a different note. Maybe start it on C instead of A. All of the phrases in the first section of the piece emphasized tonic. This makes sense because tonic's the most important note in the piece. However, for the second section of the piece, let's do something different. Let's emphasize a different note. This will not only make the music sound different, but it will give it a feeling that is less grounded. It'll feel like it's sort of floating above tonic. And that will make it feel like it comes back to ground when we return to tonic at the end of the piece. So let's emphasize the pitch B. Let's have our scale that begins this section end on a B. Maybe we could add an arpeggio before that B to further emphasize the B. Let's put another B in. That B can be up an octave, and it can start to fall down a scale and then stop, and then go back to that higher B and start to fall down a scale and then stop, and then maybe jump up to an E, which then falls down a scale of an octave or 2, ending on an E to complete this section of the piece. By ending on an E, we've set up a note that's going to give us a really strong move back to tonic at the end. There are a number of things that are unsatisfactory about this second section. putting in all these eighth notes seemed like a good idea when I did it, made a nice rhythmic contrast with the first section. But to be honest, it just slows the motion down too much. Second, this idea of emphasizing the supertonic just isn't strong enough. And finally, I just have trouble hearing the cadences. I think we need to strengthen the cadences. We can make the cadences stand out by putting 16th notes between all of the eighth notes except those notes at cadence points. We can strengthen this feeling of floating on the supertonic by making all of the 16th notes that we add between the eighth notes in the middle phrase into Bs. If we wanted, we could quit right here. We have two self-contained sections. That could be enough. I think it would be nice if we ended on tonic. Makes a really nice effect to go back to tonic at the end. Some music theorists think that it's absolutely necessary to return to tonic at the end of the piece. I don't think that's true. We'll discuss that more later. But for now, let's add a couple of more notes and see if we can finish this piece off. Well, maybe I'm just hard to please, but I think that artistically, that ending is not what the piece needs. I think we need more music in the tonic key at the end. So what I suggest we do is we go back to the beginning, pick up that large capital A, and repeat it at the end. So we have large capital A, large capital B, and then large capital A again. Great. So there's our complete binary form. If I were teaching this material to an actual class, it is about at this point that the students would begin debating whether good old Dr. Fruwall was losing his marbles or not. They would point out to me that this is not a binary form. It has three parts, A, B, A. I would explain to them patiently, or maybe not so patiently, that musical nomenclature does not always follow common sense. It does not always match our perception of the music. This particular kind of binary form is known as a rounded binary. Rounded binaries have a return of the material from the A section at the end. This may look like an ABA form. It may even sound like an ABA form, but it's not considered an ABA form. Take a look at our chart. There's a nice vertical line between the A and the B section, the large capital A and the large capital B, toward the beginning of the chart. This indicates a breaking place in the form. If this were a classical period rounded binary, there'd be a repeat sign there, so that there would be two large sections, the first one having a capital letter A and a repeat, the second one having a capital letter B and then a capital letter A and then a repeat. So a rounded binary has two sections, both of which repeat. It's a little confusing because the form is asymmetrical. The first A is shorter than the second section, which contains the B and the A. But in the second section, the B and the A are linked together. They're really not separate, so it's not an ABA. It is actually a binary form. Having settled that dispute, I think it's time to sit back and marvel about exactly how wonderful this whole process has worked out. It is actually kind of hard to believe that a few simple melodic building blocks placed together could create such a convincing classical period piece. I'm not sure if you did this at home yourself, if it would work out quite as well. And there's a good reason for that. There's something that I've left out. There's something that I haven't revealed. I'll talk about that in the next video entitled Going to Music.